singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God.
Hey, church family, thank you for joining us for our Wednesday night Bible study. We'll get started with Daniel chapter 8, the second half of that in just a moment. I want to remind you about some people that are on our prayer list. Continue to remember Lachlan Beatty, that's Scott and Carmel's little boy. He had a procedure this week as he recovers, and also Carmel's sister Candace. Need to remember also Virginia Bailey's mother Sybil, who is not doing well, and Hector Cortez's father Julio. He is in the hospital in El Salvador after suffering a wreck, has a very severe leg injury, but he cannot have surgery until they find some blood donors for him. Hector's put that plea out in El Salvador for people to go by the hospital and donate blood so that his dad can have surgery. So please pray that people's hearts will be open and they will do that. By way of announcements, ladies, I have a couple announcements for you. One is that ladies' Bible class will not meet October 13th. That's because of fall break. You will resume October 20th. Ladies who love and miss the Fill My Cup devotional, you are going to enjoy this. You're going to meet Thursday, October the 15th at 7 p.m. Now, you're going to meet via Zoom, so it's going to be a digital meeting, but I know that a lot of our ladies have really been missing that, and so they're going to start that back up. You can text or call Margie Busby if you want more information about that, but you will need to let her know that you're coming so she can send that link to you, and her information is in the handout you should have received via email. As far as our young people, fall retreat is coming, and that's going to be November 13th through 15th. So parents of any of our kids that are in the youth group age, this is the big youth retreat we have each fall. You need to check your email and see the email from Billy that he sent and make sure to sign your child up very soon. The college Bible class is going to be meeting on Sunday mornings now at 9 o'clock in the Rowlett Room. We have a space reserved for you. And another announcement about education, Bible class teachers from the spring quarter, that's the last time we met in person. Bible class teachers from the spring quarter, we need you to bring your books back and turn those in so that we can put them in the education room. As far as activities, the end of this month, October 31st, from 3 to 5 p.m., we are going to have Trunk or Treat. Excited about that, excited about opening it up to the community. And what we need from you right now is if while you're out shopping for your groceries, if you'll pick up an extra bag of candy and bring that by the church building, we're going to pre-bag the candy this year and hand it to the kids. So it'll be just a lot safer. We think people will feel more comfortable with that. But we need that candy so that we can start working on that. So if you don't mind, bring that candy by the church building, the church office, and we'll have a little basket area where you can drop that. As far as our reopening, coming this October the 11th, this Sunday, I'm so excited. We're going to have Sunday morning Bible class. Adults, you're going to be in the auditorium, and Jeff Johnson is going to be teaching a class on the parables of Jesus. And then all of our children's classes are meeting. Parents, make sure that you escort your child to that class and make sure they have the mask on and all those proper safety precautions, right? And let's be patient with each other because we're just learning as we go. We have safety measures in place, but we realize that we just need to be patient with each other, and we're going to be just fine. On Sunday, you are going to be treated to two different men preaching on Sunday. Robbie Ellis, one of our new members, is going to be preaching Sunday morning, and Jeff Johnson is going to be preaching Sunday night. And I'm just very excited about both of those guys and the fact you are going to experience a wonderful lesson from the Word of God from both of those men. And we are so blessed at West End to have so many men who can step into that role and do that, and I'm just excited you're going to have that opportunity. On Wednesday, October the 14th, our children's classes will still meet. Again, parents, please take your children there. for the auditorium class, since both of our Bible class teachers are going to be out, the elders have said, hey, let's have a singing service. We haven't done that in forever. So Wednesday night, October the 14th, all adults will be in the auditorium for a song service, a devotional period. You're going to be praying together, and we'll have a devotional thought. But that'll be in the auditorium on October the 14th. On the 21st, we'll resume back with those classes that we are going to have. So wanted to make sure everybody knew that. That's something that's kind of new, and wanted to make sure you had that information. On October the 14th, we're having a song service that night. The children's classes will still meet. So a couple other things. Don't forget the $1 Million Sunday. If you haven't had a chance to turn in your contribution for that, you still have time to do that. And make sure if you're writing a check, put EEM in the memo field. If you're going online to the online giving portal, there's a specific area where you can designate that information or that donation to go to EEM, Eastern European Missions. So that's what I have for you tonight. And this will be the last time that we do the study of the visions of Daniel digitally. Now, it still will be live streamed. All of our services are going to be live streamed, but I will be in person teaching this the next time that I teach it. But tonight we're going to finish chapter 8, and really a lot of this is going to be reviewed, but we're going to get some more historical context in our study tonight of Daniel chapter 8, which we'll explore more in depth in later chapters. But hope that you enjoy our study tonight of Daniel chapter 8 and the interpretation of Daniel's vision of the ram and the goat. Let's do that now. As we continue our study of chapter 8 tonight, we're going to be in verse 15 in just a few moments. I want to review before we get into the rest of chapter 8 and the interpretation of Daniel's vision that he has had. If you'll remember, the vision we're looking at that's going to be interpreted for us tonight it comes 2 years after the one that we saw in chapter 7. This is going to focus in on 2 of those empires that are talked about both in chapter 7 and in chapter 2. And tonight we focus on the idea of who is the ram and who is the goat represents. And of course we see, Daniel sees this mighty ram that is wreaking havoc in all different directions. And we're going to be told tonight definitively that ram is the Medo-Persian Empire. And then a goat comes, and the goat overcomes the ram. And we learn tonight that the goat is representative of the Greek Empire. And then we go a little further into this, and he tells us that there's a mighty horn that appears on the goat, and that, of course, is going to be Alexander the Great, all of this fitting into historical context. And then that horn is broken. And of course, we made the observation last week that Alexander the Great died at a very young age, in the middle of, the height of his power, right? And that's what's said, that when he's at his greatest, he's going to be broken. And then 4 small horns arise, and we say that eventually ends up being the 4 generals that make up 4 different divisions of the Greek Empire, and one of them is kind of specifically focused on. And that's the reason for that is that there was one that was going to cause trouble for God's people. And so that's the horn that Daniel focuses in on, or that his direction is focused on during that vision. And tonight we'll understand more about why that is the case. And so as we look at this, we're going to study tonight specifically about this particular interpretation. Now, we're not going to get into all the history of this, because we're also going to revisit this idea again later in our study. So I'm going to be somewhat general tonight as far as some of the historical specifics, and then get a little more specific at a later date when the text allows us to do that. So as we begin in verses 15 and 16, the first thing we see is, of course, Daniel has had this vision, and he wants to understand it. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. So we have this interesting scene here, and we know that angels have taken the form of men, and that Daniel is having a vision that has been given to him from heaven. And so as we look at this, we would say either this is this might be God, this might be an angel, but anyway, someone is standing there, and they seem to have some kind of authority. So we would seem to think that this would probably be more like God or Jesus in this particular situation. But he says in verse 16, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Now, Gabriel is an interesting character, because Gabriel is an angel. Now we see this only, the only time in the Old Testament, by the way, that Gabriel is mentioned by name is here in Daniel. He is of a great help to Daniel on more than one occasion, but we see him here in Daniel, but then we see him again in the New Testament. And in the New Testament, when we hear from Gabriel, he's making some pretty important announcements. He's giving some important information. Gabriel seemed to be an angel that was trusted with very important information and the understanding of that information. Now, that's really as far as we can go with that because we don't have a lot of background for him. But as we think about this and we think about the situations he appears in the New Testament is when he is announcing the birth of John the Baptist before Zacharias and then also explaining what is happening with Mary and that she is carrying the Son of God with her. He's involved in all of that. And so that makes him a very fascinating character to me in the Word of God, that he is entrusted with such important messages at important times and revealing things, having understanding, given understanding and passing on understanding during very important times. And one of the things that he explains right away to Daniel is what we find in verse 17. So in verse 17, so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. Sometimes people say, well, I know that I've seen angels. Well, most of the time in the Bible, when people saw or encountered angels or what they came to understand were angels, even if they were in the appearance of man, they were frightened. There was something about that individual that frightened them. So Daniel is afraid, and Gabriel says, he says, but he said to me, understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And this is one of those passages in Daniel where people they'll stop here and they'll run off in any number of crazy directions. Notice he doesn't say for the end of time. He says for the time of the end. One of the things we have to remember as we study the Word of God is that all Scripture should be taken in context. And what that means is it's kind of like looking at a painting. You have to kind of step back in order to appreciate the entire painting, right? If you stood super, super close to a painting and you were right up against it, you don't get the whole picture. And so in essence, what we have to do many times in Scripture, we read a particular verse, is back up a little bit, look at the verses around it, and then look at the entire book that it's contained in, and then look at the entire Bible, right? So we kind of keep pulling out, and it's then that we can start to understand what's happening. And we get some clues here, because the context in which we find that statement is right after the end of the vision that Daniel's had, where there were others who were seeing all this happening in the vision and were asking, how long is this going to take place? And they are told, again, kind of another difficult passage in Daniel 8, for 2,300 evenings and mornings. And then it's going to be over. So here, the discussion about the time of the end is in regards to what has just been discussed. That scene with the ram and the goat and the horn and the smashing of the horn and the four little horns and then that one little horn, it just really starts to cause a lot of trouble for God's people and just wreaking havoc everywhere. That's what he's talking about. When is that going to end? Because they were told 2,300 evenings and mornings. Well, what does that mean? What end are we talking about? And of course here we are talking about this time of the end that eventually, as we study this tonight and in subsequent chapters, we're going to learn that this is that end of the atrocities that will occur during what we sometimes call the intertestamental period, or that time where Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, is the one that is causing those atrocities on the Jewish people. And that will eventually come to an end. And so as we see that, that's what he's referencing. He says, these things are about that time of the end. What you have seen is that God ultimately is going to triumph, even in this particular difficult situation. Remember, this question is being asked in light of some of the other passages that we see in this particular case. And if you look at verse 19, he says, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. And again, in the context of this passage, we're looking at this specific vision that Daniel has had. This is not the only time, by the way, the Bible talks about the time of the end. There are multiple ends that are discussed in the book of in the Bible, such as in Ezekiel chapter 21 and verse 25. And ESV calls this the time of punishment, but it's the idea that this isn't going to last forever, what's happening to the people. There's going to be a time of punishment for these nations that are going to come against God's people. In Amos chapter 8 and verse 2 is a reference to the end of Israel's reign, that they fall to the northern kingdom, Assyria, right? And then we also see in Lamentations chapter 4 and verse 18, Jeremiah talks about an end to Judah, to Jerusalem. And of course, that's the idea of that Jerusalem eventually falls, Judah falls to the Babylonian Empire. So it's obvious that it's pointing to some future event, but it's in the context of a vision that Daniel has just had. And that's what we're talking about. To take this and just throw it to some time still to come is problematic because it doesn't fit the historical context, and it doesn't fit the context even of this particular chapter or subsequent chapters. So as we get into our history tonight, that's kind of really what happens. What's about to transpire is we're told some things that we did not specifically know before, such as who the ram is and who the goat is, and we've already discovered that, but there's some other history that we find here that is fascinating history. And like I said, we don't have time to get into all of it tonight, but let's begin looking at verses 18 through 25. It says, "And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep and my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up. He said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end." God had a plan of even ending those atrocities. He knew what he was doing, right? Come to verse 20. "As for the ram that you saw, with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia." He just flat out tells them, doesn't he? Verse 21, "And the goat is for the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, four kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall rise up against the prince of princes, and shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now." Again, here in that verse, right, it wraps back around and says, oh, by the way, this is about those evenings and mornings that we've talked about, those 2300. So what does all this mean? As we think about this, the clear information we get here, obviously, is the ram is the Medo-Persian Empire. There's two horns there. One was larger than the other, and that was representative of the Persian Empire, kind of envelops the Medes at some point in time. We also receive clear information about who the goat is, and that represents the Greek Empire. The great horn is Alexander the Great. We talked about a lot of this last week. The breaking of the horn is the representation of his untimely death. And then these subsequent four smaller horns that arise there's a lot that happens, by the way, but after Alexander the Great's death, and where we come down to these four individual horns, there's lots of turmoil that happens in the Greek Empire after Alexander's death. The fact that there is no heir, the fact that there are these generals, and with power comes corruption, right? And that's in essence what happens. And over a series of wars and events and battles, we eventually get down to where the Greek Empire kind of ends up in these four divisions in the hands of these four former generals, so to speak, of Alexander the Great. You have Antipater, Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Lysimachus. And then eventually Antigonus is defeated by Seleucus, which is another general that has had allegiance to others, some of those others in that list for a while. And eventually he kind of conquers the area, and we have the Seleucid Empire, which kind of envelops the area of Palestine, but it's right there on the edge of the Ptolemy Empire as well. And the Ptolemies and the Seleucids begin to fight each other. And this is all transpiring over years and years that's happening here. And in the map that I have on the screen for you kind of shows you how the Seleucid and the Ptolemy Empire kind of merge right there in that Palestinian area of the world. And so they go back and forth and fight over that area. And eventually the Seleucids win. The empire kind of dominates in that area. And you have the Antiochus group that forms. The Antiochus IV is the one who ultimately defeats those Ptolemies. And eventually what you have is a person whose name becomes Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And I apologize, by the way, last week for mispronouncing the name Antiochus. I've never heard it pronounced like I pronounced it last week. I don't know why I did pronounce it that way, but I did. But Antiochus IV comes to power, and he is that king of bold face that we read about in verse 23. And the reason we say that is, look at what it says. It says, one who understands riddles. Now, that's kind of a strange thing to say there, and it really kind of is the idea of this evil. It's a person who has a propensity for evil. That doesn't really come across that way in the ESV, but that is what is meant by that phrase. He understands riddles. He also says his power shall be great, but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction. He shall succeed in what he does, destroy mighty men. If you look at the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the idea Epiphanes there is this concept that he believed that he was deity. He often called himself Theos Epiphanes, which means the manifest God. So you have a person with a literal God complex who is violently trying to overtake an area where the Jewish people would be residing in Jerusalem. And he doesn't like them. While the Ptolemies were in charge of that area, it wasn't so bad on the Jews, but when the Seleucid Empire takes over, they don't treat the Jewish people very well. And it gets to a point where they're desecrating the temple. As a matter of fact, Antiochus IV actually worships the god Zeus in the temple of the Lord. And this is that scene, we're going to talk more about this later, where he slaughters a pig there in honor of Zeus. And of course, that was one of the most unclean animals that Jews could think of from the Old Testament covenant that they were living under. And you slaughter that pig in one of the most sacred places of the Jews, in the temple. And so all of these are discussion of he killed Jews, he caused all kinds of trouble. And like I said, we'll get into some of the more specifics of that. The book First Maccabees, which I mentioned last week, that is an apocryphal work. There is still some historical significance to that book. It seems to be verified historically anyway, that we see a lot of those atrocities described. And they are atrocities. Come back what he says here in verse 25. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. In his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. And there are some things that happen that he does that designate that. And then listen to this. He shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but not by human hand. The ESV kind of seems to translate that in a little bit of a confusing way to me, because it sounds like that the prince of princes is going to be broken. The idea is that eventually Antiochus is defeated, obviously. But when we look at it here, it says the prince of princes. And I think that is a comment that is directed towards God here. And the fact that Antiochus is going to seemingly be able to carry out these atrocities even in the temple of God. And that's going to be significant as we talk about that a little bit further in future lessons that we have. But overall, what Daniel is being told is that things are not going to be good. And then he's told to seal this up. He's told us, let's stop this. Let's seal this up. And he says this is about something that's going to happen many days from now. It's not going to happen like right now, Daniel. It's going to happen in the future. And we look at the history of this, between the time that Daniel has this vision and the time that all of these atrocities are carried out is about 400 years. So Daniel is being given this information 400 years before it happens. And he's carrying the weight of that, knowing what is going to happen in the future. Seemingly abruptly, Daniel's told, like I said, just to stop and to seal up the vision, to kind of keep it secret, so to speak, because it's going to be something that happens in the future. But Daniel is overwhelmed by this. Come back with me to verse 27. It says, and I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Daniel gets this news, and you probably have been this way too. You probably have received a phone call out of the blue, or something you've been told, something that transpired, and you literally get a sick feeling in your stomach, right? Your stomach drops, and it's such bad news. Daniel has to live with this information. And really, honestly, let's just be honest, the interpretation he's been given is not 100% satisfactory to him. And we're going to come back and see that again, because he's like, well, I still don't understand what is happening here. What is going on? And why is this going to be allowed to transpire? Well, notice we said that we talked about transgressors back over here in some of our earlier verses that we looked at in verse 23, the latter end of their kingdom when the transgressors have reached their limit. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in subsequent lessons as we continue our study of this. But as we come to a close of our study tonight and the end of chapter 8, and like I said, I know that I haven't given you a whole lot of specifics about what's happening here in chapter 8, but we're going to return to this again. So I don't want to give away everything at once. I want you to be wanting to come back and study more on this. In Daniel chapter 8, one of the things that I think we see here is that, God is willing to help us in times where we don't understand what's happening around us, when life is very challenging. But we have to understand that when we ask, we may not always understand the answer that we are given. And it may leave us even sometimes feeling a little bit sick at our stomach as to, God, why would this be allowed to happen? Approaching God's throne should be our first response when we encounter things like this. And it's Daniel's first response. God, what is going on here? What is happening? Daniel reaches out to God. When we have these challenges in life, and we're not understanding, our first response should be to go to God. He shouldn't be our last resort, right? Daniel's going to God primarily, not as a secondary source, as a primary source for answers. But even when you get the answers, can't they just be frustrating in life sometimes? They sure can. I don't understand why suffering would continue to exist. And a lot of times people throw that in our face as to, well, if God is really God, why is there suffering in the world, right? Well, we're not always meant to understand exactly why things are happening. Paul in 2 Corinthians, in chapter 12, in verse 8, he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, the thorn in the flesh. This is the reference to the thorn in the flesh. I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me, but He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weaknesses. Therefore, here was Paul's response to God saying, I'm not going to remove that thorn in the flesh. I'm not going to do it. My grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect in weakness. Here's Paul's response. Because that's an answer. It's like, well, you didn't really tell me why you didn't do it. But he did. Paul gets it. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. And here's why, he says. Here's why. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He realized that his strength did not come from understanding all the time why he was in the circumstances he was in. That Paul understood that his power was not just of his own ability. That really he was strongest when he realized his weaknesses in light of God's strength in his life. That his true strength came from God, not from himself. Living in the world we live in today, there are moments that we have come to realize that there's only so much that we can do. That God can do so much more. We've seen time and time again, lesson after lesson in life, or at least I have, and I hope that you have as well, when I've thought, man, this is horrible, this is a terrible thing that's happening, and it is a terrible thing, but there's been a lot of good things that have come from it as well. And there's been a lot of tragedy, don't get me wrong, but there have been reconnections of people that haven't talked in years. There has been the forcing us into spending time sometimes with our family when maybe we took that for granted, but we should have been focusing on that a little bit more. There have been some blessings, even in the midst of this pandemic. Do I understand all that? Do I understand why that continues to allow to destroy? No. But I understand that God's power is made perfect in weakness. I'm not saying that God sent the pandemic. I'm not saying that God is trying to teach us a lesson necessarily, but there are lessons to learn if we'll open our eyes in our hearts. And there are blessings that can come even in the midst of very difficult times, if we will but listen and find strength from the Lord. Hope this has been an encouraging study for you tonight. Like I said, we'll be back next week. And next week, we'll actually be doing this in the auditorium, so it'll look a little bit different. I'll be out of town, so it's probably still going to be recorded. But we're going to look at Daniel chapter 9. And Daniel chapter 9, the first part of that, is a very, very interesting kind of interlude to all this that we've been talking about. Daniel kind of steps back for a moment and takes stock of what's going on, and he prays to God, and the words that come from his heart are beautiful. And I'm glad that we have them recorded in Daniel chapter 9, and we'll look at that next week. God bless, have a great week, and Lord willing, we will see you sometime soon.
Before I spoke a word, you were singing over.